treatment of First Nations peoples in Western Australia. The West Australian, Saturday the 16th of April 1904, warning images of First Nations peoples who have passed on. Article titled Blacks, How They Are Treated. I have read with interest the controversy which has been going on in the dailies during the last week or two with reference to the treatment dealt out to the West Australian black. And I have been not a little bit surprised at the attitude adopted by such men as the West Australian Agent General in England, Sir John Forrest, Mr. W. Kingsmill, and others. Mr. Walter Malcolm, in his letter to the Times, put the matter too mildly. He is right. These who contradict his statements are woefully wrong. As a West Australian, and one who has had an intimate knowledge of the relations existing between the whites and blacks of the West, and my experience extends from Fremantle to Wyndham in the north, and from Perth to Hampton Plains in the east, I have no hesitation in stating that the blacks of West Australia have not only been the victims of isolated instances of cruelty, but have had practiced upon them brutality of a most systematic character, and this condition of things has not been tied to the rough material, of which stock riders, general bush hands, and such are composed squatters have participated in and connived at these cruelties, these immoralities, to such an extent that if the whole truth were known the world would be staggered. The punitive expeditions of the Queensland Mounted Police are no parallel to the terrible treatment meted out to the unfortunate black of the Western Colony. The Queensland black, especially in the northern parts, was more ferocious and bloodthirsty than his western brother, Hearst. Perhaps there was some excuse for the harsh retributive justice dealt out to him. On the pearling grounds of the Western Colony, the cheap labour of the unfortunate nigger was utilised in shallow diving, and it may interest advocates of the indenture system to learn how his services were obtained. During the time of my residence in the pearling grounds, extending from Shark's Bay to Roebuck Bay, a fiend in human form who was known to the natives as Big M was his surname, but he was of enormous stature, nevertheless, entered into the lucrative business of blackbirding, that is, recruiting labour for the laws employed on the grounds. High system of recruiting, however, differed from that obtaining among the islands of the Pacific in that he simply stole at dead of night into a camp of sleeping blacks and secured by means of chains as many of the unfortunates as were capable in his opinion of engaging in the work of diving. After having been secured by neck chains, these unfortunate wretches were taken down to the coast, and M would be paid some ucli per capita, according as the physical development of the individual nigger oriented. As much as $1 has been paid to this slave hunter for a fully developed young aboriginal. The time of which I am writing was prior to the introduction of that piece of iniquitous legislation, the Indenture Act. This statute was made law ostensibly for the purpose of protecting the Aborigine for whose welfare the paternal West Australian government was ever so solicitous, but was, in reality, nothing more nor less than a move on the part of the government to work into the hands of the squatters. And this is why the indenture system was introduced into West Australia. Under the old system, when a black absconded, the squatter was compelled to go in search of him himself. Hick in country such as the Northwest not infrequently entailed several weeks' search. Buys joss of time the Northwest squatter could hardly be expected to afford. Under the indenture system, the aid of the police could be called in, and the nigger run to earth at the expense of the country. The indenture system means that a number of uncivilized blacks, many of them never having seen a white man before, are brought before a magistrate or J.P. by policeman, mind you, and put through a sort of form of which they know as much as a pig does of a paternal relation. The squatter or pearler on his part undertakes to clothe and feed the nigger properly, and generally to look after him, but what do we find? The unfortunate black is provided with an old shirt at the utmost. This constitutes the clothing, and is given a handful of flour now and then. For meat food he has to forage for himself. Should he become dissatisfied with his treatment and abscond, Huey Blatter and the squatter are on his trail, and it is woe betide him when he is caught. I have seen a boy tied to a stockyard fence, and lashed with a 12-feet stock whip until there was nigh an inch of sound flesh from the nape of his neck to his buttocks. After his flogging, the poor wretch was cut down more dead than alive, but how many have died under the ordeal? One, to my knowledge, a dozen. The niggers of the North were treated by the squatters in the light of common stock, that is, as you would I have 1,000 head of cattle on station, so the affluent Nor'wester would assert I have 50 niggers belonging to me. But the majority of the Northwesters have bad memories for faces, and sometimes Billy or Damper, or Pompey become mislaid, and after a lapse of a year or two became unrecognizable. To obviate ibis, the firebrand was brought into requisition, and I have seen young bucks branded in the fleshy parts of the body with an M, an E, or RB/, generally the first letter of the station upon which the unfortunates were to be engaged. Only fancy, the letter, an inch long, burnt into the living flesh. Of course it was indelible, or that was all the squatter cared for. I do not know Mr. Walter Malcolm, but one do know that what he says is true. Let me tell of a novel and humane system which obtained on the Northwest Pearling Grounds some years ago in order to test the veracity of a black diver, that is, in order to ascertain whether B had been to the bottom for shell or not. The expedient of knocking the black fellow back with an oar who came to the surface empty-handed was found to be a bad-paying proceeding, for in many cases the unfortunate nigger was drowned, and consequently was a dead IO3s to his own. The niggers were ordered to bring up bottom every time, so that in coming to the surface they had to show their hands. There was no danger in this, and besides, butting a nigger in the head with an oar is likely to cause him to become an easy prey to sharks, which usually swarm in the northern latitudes. The last stage in the nigger's apprenticeship is perhaps fitting for a miserable life. When his time had expired, and the day approached for the employer to convey them to the mainland, they were mustered forward in the bows, and told to jump overboard and swim ashore, and their humane employers and white assistants amused themselves by shooting at the blackheads bobbing in the water, or at such of the floating bodies as had been rendered lifeless when these blacks first jumped overboard. If I remember right, a conviction was once secured for this species of amusement. The sentence was a few years in Fremantle jail. I could cite a score of cases where systematic cruelty is practiced upon the natives of West Australia, and it is strange if the leading politicians of WA 3D not know that such existed and does still exist. It, however, suits their purpose to differ from the statements made public by Mr. Malcolmson. One question: can and will Sir John Forrest or Mr. Kingsmill, or Bishop Riley, or Mr. Lefsey, tell the public why the Reverend J.B. Gribble encountered such strenuous opposition from the equitocracy of the Rascoyne River against his establishment of a mission in that locality? Was it not because the large landholders in that locality feared his straightforwardness, knew that if Beelzebub listened himself the little game would be up, and that the barbarities which had been practiced upon the nigger from the advent of the white would be exposed to the outside world in all their naked horror? Does Sir John Forbes not know that one member of Perth leading families made a boast when he came south that he could pick a piccaninny from a gin's back at 500 yards without injuring him? That a member of one of the 6 families received 2 years jail for THS murder in cold blood of a young nigger who had eaten a portion of his saddle flap. Do the gentlemen named not know that it is common sport for policemen when in search of runaways to hunt them into trees and shoot them as they would opossums? But enough. Sovereignty, yes. Constitutional recognition, no. Stop the forced closures of remote Aboriginal communities.